If microbes are speaking to each other in chemical sentences, which they do, then what are we saying to them with all the chemicals that we employ in our landscapes, with all the chemicals we employ in our homes, with all the chemicals we employ on our bodies? I think we have to be very careful about all that and try to, keep our landscapes, whether it's the landscape in a watershed or the landscape inside our ear, maintain those landscapes in a way that really does respect all the biodiversity, and that means microbial too.
Greetings to you all, wherever you are, and welcome to this month's Life Saves the Planet presentation. This month, we are delighted to present to you Kristin Ohlson, author of Sweet in Tooth and Claw, a new book that is a very important guide to rethinking evolution and what the forces are that have really shaped our planet, what they include that has been left out, but that are very much central to the living, breathing planet that we are a part of. Kristin is an author from Portland, Oregon. She's probably best known to many of you as the author of a book in 2014 called The Soil Will Save Us, a title that is very arresting and helped to call attention to the critical role of soil in the health of the planet. And the book she is writing now, 8 years later, follows that up and expands the importance of the entire biome. Kristin is also a prolific traveler, and in addition to her 6 books, because she's also a novelist and has done a remarkable job bringing together what she has learned on her travels into books that are both interesting fiction to read, but also bring very important truths to the reader. I'm not quite sure what else to tell you about her, except that I know that you're going to really enjoy meeting her and hearing about this book. She's going to be joined in conversation by Jim Laurie, who is a futurist, staff scientist at Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, and an eco-restoration restorer, a consultant in eco-restoration of many kinds of landscapes and biomes on this planet. So Jim has learned a great deal outside of academia as well as in academia after he finished his work at Rice University and his, I believe already then, his master's in future studies. He went to work for Bayer, which is a chemical giant that now also includes Monsanto. And while there, was responsible for dealing with the incredible toxic waste that was being put out by the plant. And he decided to educate himself on ways to deal with that would not be harmful to the planet and simply be adding more toxicity. And he went and got to know John Todd, who was on Cape Cod at
New Alchemy.
At New Alchemy Institute that John Todd had started in the Hyannis area, and learned how to purify very toxic water using biological means, and went on to run a biological wastewater treatment plant for Burlington, Vermont. He then also studied with Alan Savory, the promoter, the person who taught us about holistic planned grazing. He further went on and did self-study in Paul Stamets' work in mycology. And fundamentally, Jim has brought to Bio for Climate many of the speakers who have been on the ground not the ones that have come to us through academia, who have been extraordinary, but the people who are close to the ground doing the actual restoration work. So this will be an interesting conversation, and I will turn it over to you, Kristin Ohlson.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's a thrill to be speaking with Jim, because Jim was one of the early people that I contacted when I was first starting to work on Sweden Tooth and Claw. I was kind of looking for the right kind of examples, the right kind of people to interview for this book, and somebody said, well, Jim would know. So I'm going to start with a little slide presentation that includes it includes some of my own photographs, and it also includes a number of photographs that are in my new book. And well, why am I showing a picture of my other book? This new book does take a step from that old book. It was super exciting for me to write The Soil Will Save Us, because I got to meet these scientists and farmers and ranchers around the world who were figuring out how to grow healthy food on landscapes without destroying those landscapes, as most modern agriculture does, and not only not destroying those landscapes, but in many cases making them healthier. So it was a thrill to be writing about that for that book. But also the reason I wanted to put this photograph up first is that it was one of the stunning discoveries for me was realizing, kind of suddenly, sitting at the kitchen table when I was putting together a lot of my notes, suddenly realizing that plants are not just takers, plants are also givers. So what the farming world gets from the agricultural chemical business is that, plants just take everything from soil and they don't leave anything behind. And that's why farmers need to keep investing in fertilizer, because plants take it all. And I realized in working on my other book that was not true, that plants, when they photosynthesize, they are taking carbon dioxide out of the air and they're making a carbon fuel to grow, to grow all their parts, but they are also sharing that carbon fuel, sometimes 40%, sometimes much more, with the community of microorganisms that's in the soil. So they're sharing those calories with those microorganisms. The microorganisms are bringing them nutrients that they've taken out of the rocky parts of the soil. They're bringing the plants water. They're moving messages around between plants and between other living things. So I didn't know what the name of that was when I wrote that book, but now I know that is what is called a mutualism. And a mutualism is any mutually beneficial relationship between two or more species. And I, loved writing about that then. And when I heard Suzanne Simard, and you can move to the next slide. When I heard Suzanne Simard, who is probably somebody that a lot of you know about, she's a wonderful forest ecologist in British Columbia. When I heard her speak at a conference about the mutualisms in a forest, then I knew that I wanted to write another book that took that idea further. So she was talking about mutualisms in the forest, and this, this is mainly the underground network of fungal organisms and fungal threads that connects the trees and other plants in the forest together. So I wanted to look at mutualisms, these cooperative, mutually beneficial interactions among species, and think about what that meant for restoring landscapes and ecosystems. So a tiny little history about Suzanne. Next slide. She came from a family of foresters in Canada, and went to work for, after she finished college, she went to work for the commercial timber industry, thinking that she was going to help them study how to better grow commercial forests, kind of like cornfields were being corn was being grown back in the United States, with a monoculture, one single species in a line with empty space in between them and no possible competition from any other plant for water, for nutrients, for sunlight. That was the prevailing idea among forestry then, that you had to grow these commercial forests like cornfields, and that that you had to get rid of any other plant. And her work quickly started to show her that that was not the right approach. She found that in a healthy forest, when she started removing plants around one of the trees, that tree didn't do better. In fact, that tree started to get sick. So she discovered that all these plants needed each other, and she ultimately discovered that they were trading nutrients back and forth through that underground network of fungal threads. And she said that anywhere that we walk in a forest, every time we put down a foot, there's 300 miles of fungal strands underneath each footstep. Next slide. And there's some of the fungal strands. Next slide. I've got two of these. So there's one. Next slide. And another one. So these are I went with her into the forest when she was working on a new project called the Mother Tree Project, and helped a little bit, although I'm not sure if I was really very helpful. But anyway, I saw these remnants of a harvest in that forest from 80 years ago, where the foresters would make that gouge in the trunk and then stick in a board where they could stand and saw the tree up higher. But all those notches that they put in there to hold the board always looked like frowny faces. So what Suzanne is trying to do is figure out ways of supporting the health of the forest while doing harvest. So in most most harvests of the past, people would take the big trees and leave the younger ones, figuring that they were the new life for the forest. But Suzanne's work has shown somewhat of the opposite, that those old trees, which she calls the mother trees, those oldest, biggest trees, are connected through those fungal strands to many, many, many other trees in the forest, to more trees in the forest than those younger trees are. And they are not only connected to many, many more trees, but they are connected to many more species of fungi that are down there in the forest floor. Including some species of fungi that only are connected to older trees and that confer special benefits. So she is really changing with this new research, where she's testing out different patches of different ways of harvesting trees while maintaining some of those mother trees and maintaining some of those some patches of trees within the harvest. So she's trying to figure out a way to respect those mutualisms that are going on in a forest to preserve the overall health of the forest. So mutualisms, as I found out while I was writing this book, are all around us. I mean, they're everywhere. They're inside us. So this is an image of the bacteria in our own microbiome. And this particular bacteria is not only found in our gut, but it is found in the soil, and it is used to make certain kinds of cheese. So every living thing is engaged in at least one, and probably many, many more mutualisms, without which they will not flourish. So we ourselves, we humans, have 35 trillion bacteria living in us and on us. And those bacteria, without those bacterial helpers, and we also have viruses living in us and fungi living in us, all these tiny living things. And without the support of these microbial partners that live in us and on us, we would not function the way that we do now. We would be very different organisms. And that's true for every other multicellular thing around us, trees and other animals and fungi. And it's, here we have an example of a beautiful photograph of coral from the Great Barrier Reef. Well, coral is a fabulous example of a mutualism. So when the little coral animals are born, and they are these tiny, teeny tiny little animals, they float into the water until they swallow a tiny alga, the tiny little plant. And they don't consume that alga. That alga becomes part of them. That becomes part of their mutualistic, that becomes their mutualistic partner. And then the little coral animal and the alga, they sink together down through the water, and they anchor themselves to the reef and begin making building and making a life as a functioning organism. That little plant that's inside the little coral animal, it photosynthesizes and gives the little animal that kind of carbon energy that plants do, and the little coral animal gives that little plant not only shelter but some nutrients, and it's a very successful partnership. You've heard about coral reefs bleaching, and when that happens, what actually happens is that the coral animal gets so stressed that it spits out its algal partner. So that's a super important mutualism. People call coral reefs the rainforests of the seas because they support and nourish so many different kinds of sea life. So that's a really important mutualism in the oceans. So this is Jonathan Lundgren, and he was featured in my last book, and he has a much bigger chapter in this book, in a fairly fat chapter called Agriculture That Nurtures Nature. And I think he's really showing with his work that we, when we look at contemporary agriculture, most of it is pretty terrible. It's crops grown in monocultures, that we have 90 million acres of corn grown in this country, and most of it is grown miles and miles of corn, a single species growing in rows, and these bare 3 feet of bare ground between them. The farmers are encouraged to plant GMO corn that it supposedly resists disease and insects, but the farmers are constantly applying fertilizer and pesticides and herbicides. It's just a terrible mess. And, one way to describe that thing that we do with agriculture as modern people, but it's also true somewhat of even ancient agriculture, is that we're simplifying nature. We're taking the complexity of nature and making it simpler so that we can manage it better. But of course, if the world is full of mutualisms, and it is, we can't expect these cooperative relationships among living things to flourish if we're simplifying, because we might simplify out some of their necessary partners. So Jonathan Lundgren, who's an entomologist, and has set up his own research station and his own farm, and works with farmers studying how regenerative agriculture and conventional agriculture compare. He's basically studying how farmers who set out to preserve biodiversity in their fields have an advantage. There's a look at this field that is so full of biodiversity, you can hardly tell what crop is being grown there, but the crop is actually corn. but there are dozens of other plants that are grown there as companion crops to nurture the soil, to attract beneficial insects, and to just enhance the overall biodiversity. In a healthy farm like that, there are birds and animals and all sorts of things that are welcome. And of course, on farms like that, they're taking an extra, they not only are, having a lot of extra plants as companions to their crop plant, but they're making sure that they are providing habitat and food for some of the most imperiled animals, like the monarch butterfly. So these are milkweeds planted with monarch caterpillars on them, hoping to give a boost to that species. So this is a very different landscape. What you were looking at before was in South Dakota. This is in eastern Nevada, which is the driest state in the Union, where a group of ranchers and scientists and government agency officials have been, for a couple of decades, have been experimenting with whether the landscape can be revived, whether the West can be rehydrated. And it was Jim who told me this story to begin with. And I thought, how can the West be rehydrated? The West has been, I grew up in a small valley town in California where it was exceptionally hot and dry in the summer. And we were always worried about fires. And I thought, the West has always been dry. How can it possibly be rehydrated? But in this case, some government agencies and scientists who work with them were concerned that the tiny little creeks in this part of the country, that they were becoming more and more degraded, getting drier and drier, and that they were no longer providing adequate habitat for the native trout. So they approached some ranchers and said, would you try grazing your cattle differently? Instead of letting, because, these creeks in such a dry landscape, these creeks are in high demand. Everybody wants some of those creeks. The ranchers want to have their land include some of these creeks. The cattle want to hang out at these creeks all the time. Other living things in the environment want access to these creeks. But the idea was that the ranchers would fence off these creeks for part of the year so that they would have a chance to heal without the constant pressure of the cattle there eating vegetation that was growing along the creeks, and the hooves damaging the plants that grow along the creeks. And so this project started. And what you're seeing right here are sagebrush and rabbit brush, which is the kind of plants that only grow where the water table is really low. They grow only in really these really arid situations. And now a couple of decades later, what they've got is this. And the reason they have this is because of this. When the ranchers started to keep the cattle away from the creeks, that allowed more plant life along the sides of the creeks. And as the plant life grew there, the beaver returned to the area, and the beaver were largely wiped out by fur traders. But here are the beaver, and the beaver also have, there are some beaver in the area, but they have a difficult relationship with the ranchers. Next slide. I didn't have a picture of the rancher himself, but I did take a picture of his boots. The ranchers were typically more interested in shooting beaver than welcoming them because they can mess up their irrigation systems. But in this case, the beaver were welcomed and quickly showed themselves to be incredible ecosystem engineers. As the beavers' dams got stronger and held back more and more water started to pool behind them. Over the couple of decades, the water table of the land has risen by 2 feet. The creeks no longer dry up in the middle of the summers as they used to. There are fewer fires in the area. There's forage growing for the cattle. It's been an amazing story of landscape restoration on a pretty vast scale. And this is a chapter, this is an image from a chapter where I visited a coffee plantation in southern Mexico, where the whole idea of the plantation is not just to maximize the yield of coffee. It's to grow coffee, but also welcome the rest of nature that lives in that landscape. So could we, next slide? This is what this coffee plantation looks like. There's, it's a shade coffee plantation, and coffee has traditionally been grown in shade. In more recent years, there's been a lot of pressure on farmers to, coffee growers to change the way they grow it, to buy into the industrial model, to eliminate the trees, to eliminate the other plants, to grow coffee as a monoculture with lots of other chemicals. Next slide. But this is what this particular coffee plantation looks like, the one that I visited. So it has an incredible diversity of birds, birds that are hardly seen anywhere else. And it really shows that if you make it a point to have the rest of nature in the landscape, to share the landscape with the rest of nature, that it will thrive. Because I think a lot of us have the mistaken idea that we can just create nature preserves and that's going to take care of nature. But if animals and birds and insects have to cross over lands that have been doused in poisons and lands that don't have enough vegetation, then they are not going to survive. They need more of the land that's available to them to be good habitat. Next slide. And this is the kind of coffee plantation that has been encouraged by the chemical companies. This is called a sun plantation. You can see it doesn't have a lot of big trees, doesn't have any biodiversity. Very different kind of thing. Next slide. This is in the last chapter to the book, which is called Verdant Cities. So many of the ideas that we have about regenerating landscapes, we think that has to happen, far away on a coffee plantation or out on a ranch or in farmland, but it's a process that has to go on in our cities too. So this chapter was based on a variety of things, but also I went to this conference in Paris of urban greening visionaries from around the world. And this here, this is by an urban visionary who wasn't at that conference. This is from a rooftop garden in Bend, Oregon. It's 3 stories above the street. Next slide. It's all native plants and native soil and some amount of native soil too. But it shows how much is possible, how many surfaces there are in a city that we can regreen. And next slide. And of course, this is an even more spectacular example. This is from Singapore, which is kind of like the poster child of the worldwide city greening efforts. It's kind of amazing because in a period of time where Singapore's population increased by 2 million people, the amount of green cover and green space also increased. So it's a really fine rebuttal of the idea that if humans are going to thrive, the rest of nature has to suffer. Singapore and some of these other cities are really showing that we can have both. We can have green, healthy cities and people So I'm going to stop with this. That's my last slide, and I'll move on to the questions with Jim.
I just wanted to show this book to the camera here. This is a beautiful book, and Patagonia has really done a lot of work to try to, and there's a lot of really neat photography in there too. So as we've seen by some of you, and I just say I've spent the last 2 weeks reading this book, and I've covered almost all of it. And what I really like is that you really go into detail about the process down in the soil, and then you spend a lot of time about the human process too, about what the things that people had to learn to be able to master this. And I just think I really appreciate that work. And I guess my question was, when you, I keep thinking about Suzanne Simard and how do we make salmon habitat? And do you have some ideas about that?
Yeah, there are a couple of places in the book where I wrote about creating salmon habitat. Mostly so there's a guy in the second to the last chapter, the 7th chapter, who bought a piece of land alongside a creek just for the express purpose of restoring salmon habitat. So what's he doing? He's planting trees. He's planting trees alongside that creek so that the water is shaded. We have done terrible things to our waterways all over the country. We have straightened creeks. We have we've cut down the trees that line creeks. We, clean the debris out of creeks, but really what we need to do wherever there's water is make sure it's shaded, try to plant things along it so that it's shaded. So there are organizations working with landowners to help them do that. And what this one landowner was doing was not only planting new trees and new shrubs along the creeks and sort of hoping that the beaver come and cut them down in the process, but worked with the Forest Service to drop whole trees into the creek so that it blocks the water. If there's not a beaver there making dams, it's nice to have something else in there that'll block the water and make it back up and slow it down so it can't rush through the landscape and head out to sea. The landscapes are really need that pushback on the water.
And I think about, and then you went off to Nevada, and Carol Evans, when I first called her to get her to come to Boston, she refused to come without the ranchers, and she brought John Griggs with her, which you got a chance to meet him too.
Yeah, those were his boots.
And I figured he's always got a new hat or whatever. But the interesting thing about John Griggs was he was really worried about the things that he couldn't control.
Right. And I think, he was worried. He said that ranchers are always worried about the things that they can't control the weather. It's hard to control fires. It's hard to control a lot of things. So they had a hard time getting used to the idea that they had to get along, that they had to coexist with the beaver, because beaver were something that, they're an unknown. They're, they could, dam up a creek and have a positive impact on the environment in that way, but then they could also get into your irrigation system and cause trouble for you. So the ranchers were not used to collaborating with the beaver, but they quickly learned that the beaver are their best friends in the rest of nature.
And I always had this impression that the beaver were trapped out, but I always thought that the beaver had to be in wetlands. And what I didn't realize is that the beaver come first and then the wetlands follow. we might have 10 or 15 million beaver on the continent right now. We probably had 200 or 300 million at one time.
Oh, we had so many at one point. Yeah. And especially in that part of Nevada, the fur trading companies, when they were competing with each other, and this is not an example of wonderful cooperation among human beings. When they were competing with each other, one of the companies gave its agents orders to exterminate all the beaver even
Sure.
if they couldn't bring them in for pelts, just to keep the other company from profiting from them. So yes, we humans have done really terrible things with beavers.
The Hudson Bay Corporation was hiring trappers because they didn't want that was the gold of the continent, and they didn't want the Americans coming across the continent to California. And then they found that other gold, so it didn't seem to really stop that.
Yeah.
And
you know, the other wonderful story about the people in Nevada too, which I didn't talk about when I showed the slide, was that here are these three groups of people who are often in conflict with each other: the government scientists, the government agency officials, the ranchers, and they decided early in this process of trying to regenerate the creeks. They decided early in this process that they were going to relate to each other in a different way. So they formed an organization that met very frequently at the beginning of the project, and still meet now less frequently. But I went to one of their meetings. They get in these big rooms, and they pull all the tables so that they make a circle so that no one person is at the head of the table, because they really want to emphasize that everybody's voice counts, everybody is respected, everybody is known. They work with a conflict, somebody who's trained in conflict management, so that if anything does come up and people get excited, there's somebody there who can try to guide them through it. And it always kind of brings tears to my eyes to see these people who could not get along, who, had a hard time with each other, cooperating in such a beautiful way to restore this environment. And somebody else just said to me the other day, well, ranchers don't like to have anybody tell them what to do. Well, nobody likes to be told what to do. Nobody wants to be told by somebody else that things could be done much better. But one of the other beautiful things about that story is that the ranchers themselves, they are out on that landscape because they love that landscape, because they think that landscape is beautiful. But even they learned to respect and appreciate that landscape even more. They started noticing things that they had never noticed before. They started paying more attention to nature's signals of renewal. So that was also they became, citizen scientists of their own land.
Well, when I first talked to Carol's a fish biologist in the driest state in the country. And, I said, well, would you come to Boston? And she wanted to bring the ranchers with her. But the interesting thing was, when she got it, she just simply said to the John Griggs, why don't we wait and see what happens? Instead of trying to figure it out ahead of time. She's an amazing observer, and just the fact that she didn't try to tell them exactly what to do, whatever. And I remember I was asking her about freshwater mussels and things like that, and could those come back to some of these streams? And she started looking, and she started finding freshwater mussels and things like that out there.
Yeah.
So that was a really huge story, and the idea about the salmon and the Samar. But the other thing about your book that I really want people to hear is this idea. You have a chapter in here that says we need new metaphors, and we got into this idea. The title of your book. This idea of sweet in tooth and claw. And when I was trying to figure out how to clean wastewater, John Todd was trying to figure out ways to do this with biodiversity, and he was really influenced by a woman named Lynn Margulis, who kind of turned evolution on its head and said we have to create microbiomes. We have to create, we have to understand. We have to create habitat for microbes. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about that you might want to share.
Yeah, the metaphor, so the title of the book is Sweet in Tooth and Claw, and it's playing on that line from the Tennyson poem Red in Tooth and Claw. So that poem was written 175 years ago. It's a very, very long poem. There aren't other lines from that poem that have traveled down time to us, and I think we sort of latched onto that. It was around the time of when the kind of intellectual thinking about nature was changing. So before the Industrial Revolution around 1750, the ideas about nature were sort of more about nature in balance and things cooperating. After the Industrial Revolution, it started to veer more towards competition, and I think that red in tooth and claw, nature red in tooth and claw, reflects that. And then, of course, we have Darwin, who was a fabulous scientist, a brilliant scientist, and spent 5 years studying nature and collecting specimens, trying to explain why on the one hand there is so much biodiversity, so many different variations of things, and why some of them stopped, why that some of them are only in the fossil record. And he played around with that set of facts and observations for 20 years, and then he read Thomas Malthus, who was a wealthy pastor who wrote about the competition for resources among humans, and said that the resources in the natural world would never keep up with the burgeoning human population, and so there would be competition among humans, and some wouldn't survive, and that was actually better for society. It would sort of make it a little more perfect, to get rid of those weaker members of society. So Darwin was moved by what he read in Malthus to develop his theory of natural selection, in which, competition for resources weeds out those who are not as fit, not as perfect for their.
Do you think we're still trapped by that belief system now?
Well, I think we are. I think we're still trapped by the idea of a competition and conflict in nature. And as I wrote about the book, as I wrote in the book, but I'm not sure if we still have time to go into it, I talked about another scientist, Peter Kropotkin from Russia, who was a major devotee of Darwin, and said, after he read Darwin and after he finished school, he set off on his own exploration, his own scientific studies, and thinking he was going to buttress Darwin's findings about competition. And what he found, what his observations suggested, were that there was a tremendous amount of cooperation and mutual aid in nature. And I think that Kropotkin's ideas would have had more currency throughout the last century. His book Mutual Aid came out in 1902, but I think those ideas would have had more currency and more of an impact on our culture had he not also been an anarchist. But he was a leftist, he was an anarchist. At a certain point, even though he was one of the world's most famous scientists and traveled all over to speak, at a certain point, his anarchism scared off many people.
When I was doing the wastewater work at the chemical plant, with trying to figure out what John Todd was doing, and John would keep telling me, it's self-organizing, put all the different species in together and it'll self-organize. But one of the things he kept saying, and he had a lot of he was influenced by Lynn Margulis a great deal, because he realized that we have to get the microorganisms. We have to build habitat for microorganisms. And as I read your book, I keep that whole idea that if we're multicellular, we have to nurture the microbiomes that we depend on.
Right.
Whether it be in the soil or it's inside our gut or whatever, the microbes are trying to teach us how to be healthy. And
they are everywhere. And, I think that's why we need to be so careful about what we do in our environments, what we do with, if microbes are speaking to each other in chemical sentences, which they do, then what are we saying to them with all the chemicals that we employ in our landscapes, with all the chemicals we employ in our homes, with all the chemicals we employ on our bodies? I think we have to be very careful about all that and try to keep our landscapes, whether it's the landscape in a watershed or the landscape inside our ear, maintain those landscapes in a way that really does respect all the biodiversity, and that means microbial too.
And I think with Samard, I couldn't think about a forest until I read Samard, because she is figuring out how fungi, how mycorrhizal fungi and plants, and especially the trees that she's studying, that they're talking to each other, that they're sharing information with each other.
Yeah.
And that's one of the most outrageous, the idea that they go, that when we actually use the fertilizers and things like that, we start breaking up those networks in the soil. And so I don't know, we're using this time up pretty fast. So but
it's going pretty fast.
We got some thoughts on that.
And Lynn Margulis is, you asked me, back in the conversation, we talked about metaphors. I mean, from Darwin down, we have talked about competition as that's what shaped evolution. But Lynn Margulis came along and said, oh, wait a minute, there would be no multicellular life if it hadn't been for that beginning mutualism that happened when one single cell organism, like 1.5 billion years ago, consumed or engulfed another single-celled organism and created a more complex cell called a eukaryote. I mean, all mammals, all animals, all plants, all fungi are made from that, all multicellular life are made from that initial mutualism, that initial act of joining.
We need to have the mitochondria, which is ancient bacteria, and we need to have chloroplasts, which is ancient cyanobacteria. So, yeah, that just turned my head upside down.
Right, and it's a whole different way of looking at evolution, because without that, nothing else would have developed.
And what was interesting about Margulis too, she was at UMass at Amherst. And she, it's interesting because a lot of the Darwin, the neo-Darwinists, as she called them, they acted like they had the final word in evolution. And they'd only gone up maybe so far. But Margulis was up much higher. And she's saying, I don't know anything yet. We have to keep learning. We have to keep learning. She was expecting people to climb even higher. And now we've got this microbiome idea. And we're finding out that our gut bacteria are talking to our brains. And most of the communication is from the gut to the brain. It's not the brain telling the gut what to do.
Absolutely, yeah.
So anyway, I'm probably supposed to ask you some questions from the audience. And I just wondered, we did have a recommendation that they recommended the Regenesis book. What is that? George Monbiot's book. They said Regenesis is a really good book that they wanted to put a plug in for that. The How to Restore Natural Biodiversity in Soil and Feed the World Without Devouring the Planet. So that was one thing that we had. And I guess what local climate change initiative programs are you sponsoring? And I could speak to that too, but if you have some ideas, what are you sponsoring in?
Well, I don't sponsor anything. There are some things that I'm involved in, and the kinds of things that I'm involved in here in Portland are just, I'm involved in a few little ecosystem restoration projects. So I know that most people don't think of ecosystem restoration as being a climate thing, but I definitely believe it is, unless we can restore, respect, and help our ecosystems thrive. Those are the systems that keep the planet running.
When I was working with Alan Savory in the 1980s, Alan Savory said that global warming is a result of the loss of biodiversity. Floods and droughts are a result of the loss of everything was a result of loss of biodiversity. And that's kind of how Bio for Climate got started, was the idea that if we can enhance biodiversity, we'd have a much better chance facing this climate crisis that we're in. And so what you're doing, what I really like about your book is that you're teaching us how to look for the symbiosis in the system. We had one question here that it said, what is the difference between mutualism and symbiosis? And I don't know if do you have a
The
definition?
difference is just that symbiosis takes place in one spot, whereas a mutualism, they don't have to coexist in the same space. So a mutualism like pollinators and flowers, the pollinators don't live inside the flowers, they visit the flowers. But a mutualism like the one in our guts, our microbiome, that would be a symbiosis because they're tucked together in the same space.
Okay, that'll work. And do you have any thoughts about it? It says the corn yields when you had all those others, when you're growing one crop or you're growing 10 or 12 crops, how does that affect the yield? Is what they were asking.
Well, I think, sometimes the yield can be less, and sometimes the yield is more. So these are called regenerative farmers who are doing that. The goal of regenerative farming is to have a healthy farm product while building healthy soil and encouraging biodiversity and giving the farmer a decent living. So one of the things that the regenerative out a lot is stacking enterprises. So they will have that crazy cornfield where the corn is growing like crazy, but then there are these other plants growing along with them, and that a lot of that is to feed the soil. Those plants are feeding the soil through their roots, feeding them carbon fuel, and they are attracting an incredible number of insects. All those other plants, and those insects, a lot of them are predator insects that kill crop pests. So that's another good reason for doing it. And after the farmer harvests the corn, then and this is the idea of the stacked enterprise, then they have their animals walk through and eat down all that plant biomass, eat it down, stomp it down, poop on it, pee on it, muck up the soil with their hooves. It's good. It's a good effect on the field. So that's some of the research that Jonathan Lundgren is doing, is comparing the results between conventional agriculture and regenerative agriculture. And he published a paper as I was finishing my book with a comparison of those fields, and even in the fields, even for the farmers where their yield was somewhat less in the corn, their profits were higher because they were not only getting the corn profits, but they were also getting the meat profits, and they also had they had to spend far less on pesticides and things to kill off crop pests.
The chemical bill is what kills a lot of our farmers.
Right.
And the yield isn't as important. It's if you're making your land healthier all the time. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense to me. And I guess one question that I had that we should give you a chance to look at is what if like you were not a scientist at the beginning of this, I don't think.
No.
But you become quite a scientist. You become quite an observer and quite a scientist, and a lot like the idea that Darwin was a great observer, but a lot of people interpreted him all kinds of ways, and he'd probably be if he showed up today, he'd probably just be aghast at how he's been interpreted. But we still have a lot to learn, and I just thought you were a writer, and so could you give some advice to writers who have big stories that they want to tell? And how can you get involved in something that to a lot of people seems very technical and complicated?
I mean, for me, it is a lot of work, talking to all these scientists, and I'm so fortunate that so many of them are so generous with their time, because some of these people who are in my book, I called them over and over and over. Can you explain this again? Can you explain this again? I don't get this. So it helps to find scientists who are really eager to explain their work. But boy, stories are all around us. And I think that anytime, for somebody, for those writers out there, anytime you get a little glimmer of something and you think, wow, that's kind of cool, that's really interesting, I'd like to look at that further. I think if you have that spark of interest in something, I think it's pretty likely that somebody else is going to too. So then your role is to sort of peel back the layers and try to get to what's going on and explain it. And that's a process that's a lot of work, but also a lot of fun. I mean, for me, writing these books about regeneration, is what basically both books are about, it's so much fun. I know that there are many of my writing colleagues who have to write about the terrible things going on in the world, and I appreciate their work. But I'm really so pleased that I'm somebody who's writing about the amazing, hopeful, regenerative things going on in the world.
We need to start. So what's your next book about?
I have a couple of little ideas for a book, but I'm going to start a little slower. I have some ideas for articles that I'll tackle next.
How long did you take on this book? Because I know
it's about 6 years.
6 years. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So wow. So I'm and then just anything that comes to mind that we forgot in this hour that we had together here.
I just wanted to say that I think many of us get really discouraged because we associate progress with a big government program or, a big initiative by institutions. And it would be great if there were some big government programs or big initiatives by institutions that would make things easier on the ground.
Yeah.
To do regenerative work. But the fact is that people are doing it on all sorts of scales all over the world. And that, we can find out about the efforts near us or far from us and take hope from them and support them and even take inspiration from them and do more of our own work. One of
the things at Bio for Climate that we got involved in, Adam Sachs really got pushing us on this idea that Paul Hawken had called blessed unrest. That kind of goes, they're trying to count all the people in the world that from the bottom up are doing this thing locally and not waiting for the leaders to come up with the perfect plan, but to just start in their backyard or in their communities or whatever. And we've done that kind of thing too, where we've just find out that it's just an infinite number of people working on this. And I think there's going to be a lot more as the crisis becomes a little bit more visible to a lot of people. So we need your books.
Well, it's the crisis and also the opportunities.
Yeah. Exactly.
Both.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So thank you.
Well, first off, I want to thank you both very much for sharing a vision of what's going on and what could be going on. I don't know whether we should have a phrase like social mutualism to replace social Darwinism. And I'm not sure whether our relationship with beaver at its best would be an example of social mutualism or whatever, but it's what needs to happen if we're going to continue to have hope for a really regenerative future. So I want to thank you both for showing us the amazing, hopeful, regenerative possibilities that are out there and that everybody can participate in. So, and I also want to thank our audience because over 100 people started and almost all of them stayed until just a moment or two ago. So you've held people's attention for good reason. And I think we are all very grateful.
Well, we can go another hour probably, right?
Okay.
So
and we'll be in touch again soon. Okay.
Thank you, Paula.